Good evening, everyone. I always make mistakes. I think now it's better. Huh? Yeah. Good evening, everyone. For some of you here in the room, it's now session number 2 with Ned Lebow. Those of you who just came out of my seminar, I'm very happy to see quite a few of you here. Very happy to see everyone here, also online. And I have the honor to introduce to you Professor Richard Ned Lebow. He's sitting to my right. And I just asked him, how should I introduce you? And then he said, well, you can say that I wrote a lot of books and I've been teaching for 58 years. But I'm going to tell you a little more about him. A few trivia, perhaps, and a few things about his really amazing accomplishments. So he's actually written over 50 books. And I really don't know anyone in the discipline of international relations, actually, or beyond that, who comes even close to that. And it's not just any books, but it's books with the major publishers, with Cambridge, with Oxford, with really all the leading university presses. And it's work that really made an impact. Yeah. Early on, he worked quite a bit on political psychology, on deterrence. Fascinating work. They're always challenging the orthodox views. He's been very good at that and doing that in intellectually really highly convincing fashion. And he has moved on to do to write on the causes of war. So you're going to hear a little bit about this today. He's written a lot on international orders and processes of ordering. He's written a lot actually on methodology as well, so how to deal with counterfactuals, also something I find really fascinating. There are a couple of trivia that I want to tell you about too, because they're fun to mention. So when we just talked about these 58 years of teaching, then that was at Yale, where he started as a teaching assistant. And one of his students was George W. Bush. Now one could say, Ned, maybe he hasn't learned all that much from you, but maybe
he never opened his mouth the entire term in class.
Okay. And no, on another note, but on a very personal note. So way back then, I was a bachelor student. One would now say bachelor student, didn't even exist at the time, at the University of Munich. And I played a lot of football, and I was always in the English garden, and oftentimes I skipped my lectures. And one lecture I would absolutely never ever skip, and that was his. It was on crisis management, and it was really fascinating and really inspired me quite a bit. And then always got interest, and it really got me interested not only in international relations theory, but also very much into crises and crisis management. And then later wrote a book about it too, with a very nice sentence written by Ned on the book cover. So on that note, Ned, thanks a lot for being here. Thanks a lot for everything over the years. And let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you.
And just one more thing about what he wants to talk, why nations still fight, is obviously when you look at it, highly topical. So some of us may have thought, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, that war really has come to an end. So we are living in a much more peaceful world now. No, but nations do still fight. The title also makes sense if one looks at Ned's work, because he's written a book in 2010. He published it, Why Nations Fight. And so if you're interested in this kind of work, then I would say read both books. Read the Why Nations Fight and Why They Still Fight, which is forthcoming. And there's another book forthcoming. I want to mention that as well. Is History, Learning and Analogies, Wars and Pandemics. So really a prolific writer. And now I'm going to keep stumm. And Ned, you have the word.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus. It's always a pleasure to come here, and all the more so because I get to spend time with my good friend, Marcus. I'm going to talk today about this most recent study of mine that addresses, to my way of thinking, one of the great, one of the great puzzles of international relations. Wars and interventions still continue. There have been, in my data set, 88 of them since 1945. And the initiators of these wars and interventions, for the most part, don't achieve their goals. Only 34% achieve a military success, and you would think, as for the most part, they have the freedom to go to war or not. They'd only pick conditions when they could win. They don't. They lose. Only 21% have achieved their political goals. And we know from the great Prussian philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, that war is an extension of politics by other means. States go to war to achieve what they can't by diplomatic means. Therefore, if you can't achieve your political goals, going to war, even if you've defeated the other side's armed forces, is a loss, because you haven't gained what you set out to fight for, and often you've lost a lot in the process or the aftermath. So that's my puzzle. Why does this still happen? It's not a secret, the low success rate, but it hasn't deterred many states from still drawing their swords. To answer this question, I put together a data set. It's the back 100 pages of the appendix in the book. And what I've done, rather than just giving numbers and coding things, is to give explanations for each case, why I've coded it as I have. I've recognized controversies when it comes to coding in certain cases where I discuss both sides and often use multiple codings if I don't have a convincing argument for one side or the other. I've put together this data set, and it includes interventions as well as wars. That's a departure from normal academic practice where they're studied separately, but really there's no effective way of differentiating one from the other. They're both resorts to force to achieve political goals. There are so-called interventions that last longer and produce more casualties than many wars. Americans, for example, officially describe their intervention in Vietnam not as a war, but an intervention. They were, quote, invited in by the local government. Intervention turns out to be a political category invented in the 19th century by the great powers in Europe. When they called something an intervention, they meant to communicate to other great powers that they were committed to maintaining the status quo. They would not change it by what they were doing. By calling it an intervention, they hoped to reduce the chance that others would intervene. Well, we should not use it as an analytical category. So I've put them both together, and I have I've excluded some interventions, some minor firefights, things of that sort, but anything that could be considered centrally directed, designed to achieve a political goal, I've included. I have an entire chapter devoted to to justifying that choice and to describing my analytical categories and my coding rules for each of these cases. As I have a half an hour in my presentation today, I'm not going to go into it at all, but I'd be very happy in the question and answer period to discuss it or to give anybody a copy of the chapter. This book differs from the 2010 Why Nations Fight because in that book I was interested in wars started by great and rising powers. I had a different set of questions I asked. I coded cases where there was a rising of great power on both sides from 1648 to the present, which was then, I think, 2006. In this book, I only look at uses of force since 1945, but by anybody and everybody. I have a different and larger set of analytical categories. I ask, in the first instance, who the initiator was. In many cases, this is obvious, but in some it's controversial. Consider the recent Gaza war. So Hamas started it by its terror attack on Israel, but as the Israeli response was so disproportionate to the attack, one has to consider Israel as also an initiator. So in that conflict, I score both as initiators. I ask who the defender was, what third parties were involved and why. I then ask what was the motive of the initiator, what were the initiator leaders trying to achieve. I code this on two levels. The first is the immediate goal. Were they seeking territory? Were they trying to punish a foreign leader or a country for something they had done previously? But I also, drawing on my cultural theory of international relations, offer a deeper level explanation. I go back to Thucydides, who has the Athenian delegates at Sparta say that they and everyone else act out of fear, interest, or honor. So interest, we all understand, is material well-being. Honor, the Greek word for it is thumos, Thumos, and it is based on the recognition that human beings everywhere seek self-esteem. We all want to feel good about ourselves. We do this by excelling in activities valued by our peer group or our society. By winning their approbation, we in turn feel good. In the modern era, people have projected their needs for self-esteem onto their sports teams, their states, and when they do well, they feel good and empowered, and they feel low when their teams or their country loses. Conflicts, therefore, competition for standing and honor, and the difference is honor is a struggle for standing achieved by rules, and standing is a free-for-all. And international relations can be both, depending on the era, the region, and the nature of the conflict, is a powerful motive in foreign affairs. Fear is an emotion, not a human motive. It arises when you think others threaten your physical security or your ability to advance your material interest or your self-esteem. We have, in international relations theories, two paradigms based on appetite, on material well-being, liberalism and Marxism. We have one on fear, realism, and I've tried to develop a theory of international relations, or I have, based on thumos, And I'm going to argue, as I did in the 2010 book, that it turns out far and away to be the dominant motive for states to use force. So is very central to international relations in theory and practice. I then ask whether the initiator was successful or not. Here too I have a double definition. The first is military success. Did it achieve its military goals? And secondly, political success. Did it achieve that? Now, if you haven't achieved your military goals, in all likelihood you haven't achieved your political goals. But it doesn't mean that if you win militarily, you achieve your political goals. So you could look at the state of Israel, which has won, in a military sense, every war it's ever fought. But in very few of them has it been able to achieve its political goals. And that's a more general phenomenon that we have to look at. So as I'm trying to explain the large numbers of failures we have, and let me be clear that since 1945, we've had, as I said, only 34% success rate in military goals and only a 21% success rate in political goals. So it's a very risky and counterproductive activity, the use of force. And why is it still done? The answer, I'm going to argue, rests in part with miscalculation. And this is the next question I asked: to what degree did leaders miscalculate? And I find in 61% of my cases there was serious miscalculation by initiators of uses of force. I break this down into three kinds of miscalculation. The first, and perhaps the most fundamental, is the belief that the goal you seek can be achieved by the use of force. In many cases, it can't. Even if you're successful militarily, it's not going to lead into the kind of political goal that you expect. Number two, they miscalculate militarily. They lose. They can't even achieve their military goals. And thirdly, they fail to consider that others might intervene in the conflict, or that it might go beyond the initial stage of military activity. So consider, as an example, the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq. Very successful at the outset. Iraqi army defeated quite rapidly with few casualties. Baghdad occupied, Saddam overthrown. George Bush landing, my former student, landing on the carrier, proclaiming victory. That turned out to be the beginning, not the end. Not that many years went by before there was an active resistance, and in the end, the Americans were all but compelled, and the British, to withdraw from Iraq. The state imploded. The Middle East became more, not less, unstable. American influence in the region declined, not increased. So if we take a longer-term perspective on success and failure, and in this study I do both, I use short and longer term, it's clear that it's an initial success, but a catastrophe in the longer term. This narrative applies to a large number of cases. So miscalculation is rife, and when I look at miscalculation, I ask why it occurs. And here too I find short and longer term explanations for it. Short-term explanations include a failure to carry out any kind of rigorous cost calculus of what war is likely to be about. A case in point, again, the American invasion of Iraq. Then Secretary of State Colin Powell had the State Department prepare a briefing book for the Department of Defense about occupying Iraq. What would happen after American forces got there? What questions would arise? How should they respond? What should they do? He sent several copies over to the Defense Department, where Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld immediately had them shredded, because the last thing he wanted was people to read this, because the State Department had argued that the occupation would be deeply problematic. If word of it got out, it would affect perhaps congressional support for invading Iraq. It would force him to use a larger force than he intended, which is what the military wanted, so it would support the military against him. So the Americans went in, and the only thing they planned to do, other than overthrowing Saddam Hussein, was to occupy the oil ministry. There was no consideration of a follow-on. Also, with these kinds of interventions in wars, there's often no plan B. They think everything will go according to their favored scenario. Well, the world is never like that. We all know that from our personal lives. And you need a plan B, a fallback position. And you need to consider the likelihood that you'll need a plan B. And maybe if that's so, plan A doesn't look so good after all, which is one of the reasons why leaders often don't have plan Bs. Intelligence, still there. Intelligence, rationalists, and I'll come back to this in the end, rationalists and realists assume that leaders are, to a high degree, rational, that they make considerations of cost and gain, that they make use of information at hand toward this end, that they gather new information to improve their analytical capacities. In practice, this isn't so. In something over half the cases, there's no evidence that the leaders or governments in question carried out any kind of thorough cost calculus. In a number of these cases, and again, Iraq is a wonderful example, the feedback networks, the intelligence, was rigged to provide the policymakers with information they wanted and to keep from them information that would be disturbing. They lived in a world of their own. People outside of government often had a better understanding of the situation than those inside, despite their access to resources of information that ordinary people don't have. I found frequently that there were deeper-seated causes for this, and I want to mention two, because I really only have another 10 minutes here. The first of these is a overvaluation of the utility of force in the modern world. People still believe that you can use force to achieve political goals. Now, it's not every state that believes this, and I'm going to come in the end to an explanation for why this is so. But it's certainly true of the great powers. and the superpowers. They stand out in having carried out the most wars and interventions. The U.S. leads the list with 13 of my 88 cases were American. And that doesn't include American involvement in multinational operations like NATO's intervention in Libya. Great powers and superpowers do this because that's how they became great powers and superpowers, by waging war. They have larger armies than everybody else. The United States spends more by a multiple on its armed forces than the next 10 best armed nations combined. I mean, that tells you what off-scale expenditure we're talking about. So they believe this, and they believe that the use of force maintains their difference from other states and justifies the special privileges that they ask for, especially the Americans who claim to be a hegemon. The second and related underlying explanation is cultural and great power arrogance. They believe that they have a right to order the world, great powers, and that their armed forces are simply better than others. The American intervention in Vietnam, and I know I'm drawing on American cases here because I think you're probably familiar with them. The book draws on cases from every part of the world and every country that's been involved in force, but in the lecture I'd have to give detail and background to them, so I'm going to stick with the better-known countries. When the Americans considered intervention in Vietnam, French authorities told them, you don't want to go there. And some American experts argued the same. The Kennedy administration dismissed the French experience out of hand. Why? The French are the French. Look how they performed in World War II. I mean, we're Americans. Their experience is not relevant to us. And secondly, and this is the other giveaway, the French lost because they were fighting an imperialist war, the Americans argued. We're coming as liberators. Of course, it's not how they were seen. So there are a set of assumptions that people and leaders have about the world that are deeply embedded in political cultures, and more so in the cultures of great powers, that blind them to the dangers of using force and make it more attractive. And interestingly, the great powers lose a much higher percentage of their wars than do other states. Now, 7 minutes here. I want to come to learning. I argue in my 2010 book that 3 ways of learning have broken over the world. The first has to do with the relationship between war and wealth. Up until Adam Smith and David Ricardo, everyone in the West believed that the wealth of the world was finite. If somebody had more, you of necessity had less. In foreign policy, this led to mercantilism, was a major source of war between England and Holland, England and France. People came to understand that wealth can be expanded through mechanical means, through economies of scale, through international trade. That peace, not war, produces wealth. And that lesson was very well learned. There wasn't a single great power war that was motivated by wealth since 1945. There have been a few wars motivated by wealth. By lesser powers, the dominant example was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. He was deeply in debt. They wouldn't forgive the debt. And if he conquered the country and took over their oil overnight, he'd be even richer. That's material. Second wave of learning had to do with collective security. Instead of looking after yourself alone, you would join with others, not only in alliances, but in broader groups where there could be some agreement, not only about keeping the peace, but norms regulating behavior among members. European Union is, of course, the most profound success. If one had said in 1945 that Europe would become what Karl Deutsch, or Western Europe and Central, called a pluralistic security community where people thought war was unthinkable, everyone would have laughed, given the history of the 19th and 20th century. But now we have achieved it, which is another reason why the war in Ukraine is so shocking to us. The third wave of learning, and the one most relevant to my study here, has to do with the relationship between war and standing. For all of history, war was how you achieved standing. Every great power, Spain, France, Britain, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Sweden, Japan in its time, all became great powers by wielding the sword. Today, and we have ample empirical evidence for this in public opinion polls, you lose standing if you go to war unless you're acting on behalf of a regional and international organization with considerable backing behind you. U.S. standing plummeted after Iraq. That lesson has been learned by many countries who are claiming standing on a basis other than the use of force. So if you think about Canada, Japan, Brazil, Scandinavia, Holland, even India, South Korea, a very good example, claiming standing on the basis of being wealthy and using their wealth to raise the standard of living of their own population, giving extensive money for development and education of people from developed countries, making contributions to international order through peacekeeping, through sponsoring such things as the Landmine Treaty, which Austria played a role, representing particular regions of the world that have been underrepresented, the global south. What's happening in international relations today is we're seeing a transformation of the markers of standing and a big struggle between these traditional great powers like the US and Russia, and to some degree China, which hasn't quite decided which side to come down on, for the conditions under which states achieve standing. The more war is seen as contrary to it, the more rational actors will no longer resort to force. That wave of learning is still breaking over the world, but I'm optimistic that ultimately it's going to lead to a very serious reduction in the use of force. Now, let me come to my conclusions here. First to the substantive ones and then the theoretical ones. Am I optimistic or pessimistic? If we look at the types of war, and I didn't have time to go through each of my 15 categories, the one that was had the most cases, 26, were colonial and post-colonial wars. Post-colonial wars consider the Anglo-French invasion of Egypt, or consider any number of wars in Africa fought between former colonies over contested territories. These wars are in sharp decline and are on their way to becoming history. That's the dominant category of war, which, like we thought measles was, and we do believe with smallpox, can be eradicated. Also, what makes me optimistic, as I noted, is this shift in how one achieves standing in international relations. And I also think that there is a structural explanation here too, that when people died in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, dying in your 20s wasn't so bad by comparison. When you produced 5 or 6 children, losing one in war was sad, but it wasn't the end of life. When in developed countries we have 1 or 2 children, and we invest a lot in them, we have a mammalian rather than reptilian strategy of reproduction, we expect them to live long, productive, and happy lives. Dying in a war is another catastrophe. So increasingly, people have moved against war, and I think that's an important underlying condition, which also has to be combined with learning, which is purely ideational. But what stands against it, and the pessimistic side of my analysis, is that the great powers haven't learned and don't seem to be giving any indication of having learned. Russia and Ukraine is the most dramatic example, but think about Trump's use of the bombing of Iran and Trump's talk about change elsewhere, and it's quite possible that we may see an invasion of Nicaragua or any Latin country while Trump is in power. And we also have the fragmentation of weak and divided countries, which invites foreign intervention, and if not direct wars, proxy wars. And I don't see a significant change in this underlying condition in the next couple of decades. So that remains very dangerous. And what I've tried to do in the book, and the reason why I use these distinct analytical categories of, see if I can remember them all, of colonial and post-colonial wars, rump states, great powers, proxy wars, ethical traps, civil wars with foreign intervention, wars that spill over into other countries. I look at all of these, and divided nations and partitioned countries. I look at these as distinct categories where the likelihood of future wars varies enormously from case to case. And here, I should mention partitioned countries. So these are the products of the breakup of empires, where 1 or 2 peoples couldn't agree on who got what territory, that one side claimed territory that the other claimed, or that one or both claimed all of the territory. So think of the partition of Ireland and Palestine, Israel, Cyprus between Greeks and Turks. I think I said India, Pakistan, and more recently Azerbaijan and Armenia. These have been the most difficult of conflicts to resolve and among the most violent. The only one that has moved beyond the prospect of war is Ireland. And I give reasons why that's so and why it's not so in the cases of others. And that's another ground for pessimism. When I look, and I'm going to take just another 3-4 minutes here, at the theoretical implications of my argument, it speaks strongly against realism, liberalism, Marxism, and rationalism, all, for the most part, powerful paradigms in international relations theory. Marxism, we don't have wars over material well-being. we have wars that are damaging to material well-being, that capitalists should not be supporting and often are not. I mean, in Vietnam, the business community was horrified that Lyndon Johnson wanted to go into Vietnam. They said, we already have inflation. It's going to be kicked up to another level. We're going to be damaged economically. Liberals assert that democracies don't make war against other democracies. Well, in my data set, I have American invasions of Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Grenada, countries that could be considered democratic. And the liberal democracies are among the most violent states in the world when it comes to attacking everybody else. So one has to think about democratic peace theory as being more ideology than empirical. Alan Stamm, Dan Reiter argued democracies win wars because it's such a good form of government. They have to be more careful when they fight, build up public support, and they're more open and rational about their strategies. Democracies won 12% of the wars in my data set, well below the average. There's absolutely no evidence that democracies choose their wars well or win them when they enter them. Realism assumes that fear is the dominant motive and it's what brings states to war. Now, in 44% of my cases, fear was a dominant motive, but in a significant percentage of those, the fear was irrational. Americans' irrational fear of communism, if it's spreading throughout Latin America. Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, thinking it had to nip Islamic fundamentalism in the bud, but bringing about the conditions that it sought to prevent. We can go through the list here of fear-driven wars and come to the conclusion that we really need an irrationalist theory of war, not a rationalist one, to explain how these fears become so dominant. And finally, we look at rationalist explanations for war, which assume that leaders only go to war when they think they have a good chance of winning them. Well, any leader who was rational would look at the record of win and loss since 1945, and he or she would say, no way I'm going down that road, because the chance of winning is so low, unless I'm absolutely have my back to the wall and I have no choice. But that is very rarely the case. So leaders aren't rational, and of course, rationalism also assumes a very clear cost calculus of action, and I've tried to show that doesn't occur in at least half the cases in my data set. So rationalist models and realism, in fact, stand in the way of an effective analysis of war. And I end with the notion that anarchy, which realists assume is what generates fear and generates war, have the arrow of causation reversed. It's wars that bring about anarchy or belief in anarchy. It's not the other way around. So I suggest that my study is a very radical one for both its substantive and theoretical conclusions, and will create, I hope, a lot of controversy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ned. Ned, thanks a lot. It was a very, very stimulating talk, and really about the big questions about international affairs. Yeah. We can move now to questions and answers. And Ned, it's usually a very active audience, so I'm going to bundle over 3 questions together.
That's a good idea.
Okay, yeah?
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you covered in your presentation, thank you for that, first of all, the fact that political and military aspects are the reasons for war. And
I'm going to come out so I can hear you better.
Okay, sorry, I can speak up.
No, I think it's my fault.
You covered mainly that political and military points are
Yeah.
the reasons for war. And I was more wondering about the economic pillar. How does economic maybe motivations or whatever that is maybe also linked to artillery link to the fact or the reason why nations start or end war?
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. That was the first one. Who else? Yes, please.
It's also good to stand up.
It is.
Yeah, hi.
Thank you for your talk. I was actually also going to ask an economic-related question, but I have another one. You mentioned the question of successes of conflict, so I was wondering, is there even such a thing as a successful conflict? And if there is, what constitutes one for you?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then maybe Clara just next to, yeah.
Oops. Also, thank you again for your talk and for talking more about the book. I'd have more of a theoretical question.
Oh, good.
You mentioned the concept of thumos that you are using as to explain as a driver of war, as it was described by I think I don't know the English like Thucydides.
Yes.
But I wanted
Thucydides in
yes.
Greek and Thucydides in German, no?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask because I read Plato also has a similar concept that he also calls thumos, but he understands it more as like the emotional power that connects rational understanding to ethical action and like a broader way. And I wanted to ask, because also your closing vote was about the irrational aspect, if perhaps there would be room to kind of broaden this part of the theoretical concept to engulf more of the
question.
irrationality.
Thank you. It was the first bundle, Ned. Are you ready?
Let me address the two of those.
Yes.
Let's first look at the economic side. As I think I said, there was no case involving the great powers in which economic motives could be considered primary. At most, they could be considered secondary. So a case in point was the George Bush Sr. War in the Persian Gulf to expel Iraq from Kuwait. It was done primarily for political reasons, but there was also the belief that if Iraq gained Kuwaiti oil, it would be seriously destabilizing for oil prices and more broadly for economics. There were cases, particularly in Africa, where economic motives were important. The First and Second Congo Wars had to do with neighboring states grabbing territory on which there were rich mineral deposits. But again, only 7% of my conflicts had either a primary or secondary economic motive. So while economics is important in politics, it's not important for the most part as a motive for war. The second issue on thumos. So Plato, Aristotle, and before them Thucydides share this, what I call richer ancient Greek conception of the mind, where they give equal play to appetite and to thumos. And if you recall Plato in the Republic, it tells the story of a character who, why he chose this example, who gets turned on by looking at corpses, but recognizes that this is socially unacceptable and wants to be seen as a good and admirable person by others, so only does it secretly. And Plato also mentions, and comes to mind, how in many cultures in his, that people, when they're served food, even when they're hungry, wait to eat until everybody else at the table is served food, because it's a social norm and you want to cut, I live in Italy, what my colleagues would say, una bella figura. This all has to do with thumos, with honor, with standing. And appetite and thumos are sometimes in conflict. What's happened in the modern era is that thumos has been purged from the philosophical and political vocabulary. And the reason for it was that thumos was a justification for aristocrats to have their special privileges. And beginning with Cervantes in Spain and writers in Holland and England, war and honor won through war was no longer seen as an acceptable motive, and rather appetite and getting rich, which was earlier seen as not so good, was raised by comparison. So we then get to Freud's model of the mind, which is libido, all appetite. And ego is what connects you to the world, and superego are the restraints that society attempts to impose. Thumos is gone. And I've tried to reintroduce it because I believe it's so central to human behavior, despite it being swept under the rug. Now, it's also connected to ethics, as you mentioned in Plato, but that's because Plato is a fairly conservative fellow. And Plato, like Aristotle, is defending the aristocratic elite. And they're the only people who have the leisure to engage in public activities and become successful and gain honor by doing that. And ethics is defined, at least in part, by Plato in that way. But later in the Republic, Plato also undermines that conception. So in the end, he offers us a much more sophisticated view of ethics, which I don't have time to go into now.
Thank you. Then we're going to do the next round. Yes, gentleman in the back. And always briefly introduce yourself, perhaps, that we, yeah.
My name is Bischoff. I'm a journalist. I wanted to ask you first, I didn't quite understand the connection between the book from 2010 and the book which is coming now.
Right.
Is this only a revision of this older book, or is it a completely new
different?
Book?
I'll explain.
And my second question is if you could elaborate a little bit on the Ukrainian war.
Right.
Is it why is Russia fighting Ukraine? Is it only great power, arrogance, or what are your explanations?
Okay.
Thank you, and then we're going to go.
Thank you very much. My name is Sarah Janine. I'm a second-year student at the Academy. I was unfortunately 10 minutes late, so I hope you did not touch upon the topic in the first 10 minutes. But throughout your talk, I was wondering about the individuals who take the decisions to go to war, and I was wondering if you believe that outcomes would be different, or if the likelihood of going to war would be different if there were more women in key decision-making positions.
Okay.
Thank
So
you. And then, sorry, need one more in that bundle. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Evan Butler, and I'm a MICE 2 student. If I understood the thrust of your book and discussion is that war is still a dominant, strain in international politics. And I'd wonder if you'd comment not on the persistence of war, but the emergence of peace. We can't count the wars that don't happen, and by all accounts, there are less wars today that involve less participants, incur fewer casualties, affect less civilian lives, and are just generally less deadly, and that the world's today is a better place to be than any other place. So what would you say to the criticism that perhaps war is a minority fringe phenomena and not a dominant strain? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Ned.
All right. Let me start with the women, because I think I can answer that more quickly. There are two ways of answering this question. The most obvious empirical way is to look at the record of women leaders. And there doesn't seem to be any evidence that they're more peaceful or less aggressive than their male counterparts. I mean, one can think of Margaret Thatcher, Mrs. Bandaranaki, Hillary Clinton. I don't think that any of these examples and others I could come up with demonstrate any greater commitment to peace or to less use of force than their male counterparts. You could come back to this argument and say, well, for women to succeed in a man's world, they have to act like men, and especially in the political world. So maybe this isn't a fair test, that to the extent to which broader culture changes and women are allowed to act more like women, then we might see a difference. Let me say, I hope you're right, but we're at a stage, even in the West, where we don't have a fair test of this yet. Let me come to the peace question. I agree in part with what you say. If we look at the number of wars in the last 400 years, as several scholars have done very nicely, we see a steady decline. Although we also see in the 20th century a remarkable increase in the casualties and deaths associated with those wars. So it is a mixed record. What we find are fewer but costlier wars. Now, you could argue, and I'd like to make this argument, that what's happened is that war, in part for some of the reasons I've explained, has become less acceptable. It's also outlawed. It's seen as bad by most of the world, so states no longer gain status. Occupying territories and even more annexing them is strenges verboten, we would say here. States still do it, but they pay a big price for doing it. China and Tibet, Israel and the West Bank. These are all positive signs. And I do believe that war as an institution is an atavism. So an atavism is something that's lived on beyond the era in which it was useful. I believe that's right. And it's yet another reason why my question of why nations still do it is more enigmatic, and I'm trying to answer it in no way, I think you understand, trying to defend the institution of war. I fully concur with you. Now, the gentleman who asked the question about the two books and about Ukraine. So the 2010 book was really an attack on something called power transition theory, that major wars are the result of rising powers, that they either start wars to gain recognition and status, or the dominant power goes to war against them before they can do this. And there's this big literature out there on this, and Graham Allison at Harvard has made a reputation by writing this absolutely terrible book. I mean, maybe the worst academic book I've ever read. I mean, it's just, on every page there's an historical error or false claim. So I looked at wars with rising powers and great powers and what happens. And I found that power transitions occur because of wars rather than being the cause of power transitions. And that what happens is that rising powers hardly ever go to war with dominant powers because it's like a club that the great powers run. And rising powers want admission to the club. And rising powers want admission to the club. And You don't get people to vote for you if you throw a rock through the window of the home of the president of the club. So you tend to go to war with weaker third parties to get recognized. So this was a very specific question, but I did also look at the success rate of wars, and I found that from 1648 to 2006, that initiators won 52% of their wars, which again seemed to me a very low rate, because presumably they would only go to war in circumstances in which they could win. Now, I didn't mention in this talk that I had another category called compulsion that I coded for. To what extent did leaders feel that they had no choice but to go to war? And I found a degree of compulsion in only 34% of my cases. And in half of those, the compulsion was imaginary rather than real. But interestingly, and I don't know why, that leaders who were compelled to go to war had a higher success rate than those who were not. And as for Ukraine, so one could code that war in several ways. I have a category called rump state. And well, speaking in Austria, this should be a very easy category to explain. A rump state is a leftover, significantly reduced territory of a once great state or empire. And in the 20th century, Turkey's a rump state, Hungary and Austria and Germany were rump states. More recently, Serbia and Russia are rump states. And rump states turn out, historically, at least in the 20th and 21st century, to be the most violent category of states. And this is because national self-esteem has been deeply depressed, and along come nationalist leaders who assert that we'll be great again, a MAGA philosophy, if you like, by regaining territory that's naturally ours. So Putin is taking a page out of Hitler's book. I mean, this is exactly the same kind of logic. And he and many Russians believe that Ukraine is Russian, has no right to be an independent state. Interestingly, in this connection, if you look at the so-called democratic opposition to Putin in Russia, almost all the people in it also believe that Ukraine is Russian and should be part of Russia and has no right to be independent. This is a widely believed trope in Russia. That is part of the reason, and connected to it is Putin's belief that he's a special leader. And I had leaders with a degree of megalomania as a cause of war. Putin, Gaddafi, Saddam. I mean, we have a list of these people, and they're different from, quote, more normal leaders. Putin and those around him are very clear in describing him as seeing himself as the direct descendant of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Lenin and Stalin, in extending and maintaining the power and territory of Russia. And all the more so since it shrunk, and he's convinced himself it's all a plot on the part of the West. And he has people like John Mearsheimer who write books to lend support to this rather silly idea. So that's what motivates it. And it's a perfect example. Did Russia carry out any kind of careful cost analysis before invading Ukraine? Obviously not. Putin was convinced that Ukrainians wouldn't resist and that many might even welcome them with flowers. They just sent forces in with no real strategy other than trying to grab the airport by Kiev and trying to assassinate Zelensky, to decapitate the leadership. They didn't perform well. It was idiocy, what they did. It's another perfect example of an irrational military activity which has led to catastrophic outcome for everybody.
Ned, thank you. And then let's just do the can we accommodate everyone in one round? I think 1, 2, 3, 4, that's 6. Can we, but let's be quick, okay? One after the other, yeah.
Thank you very much for lecture, Professor. My name is Nikita Rubman. I'm HI1 student. Looking 20 or 30 years ahead, which types of conflicts do you think are most likely to dominate? Classical territorial wars, competition over resources, identity-driven conflicts, or maybe new forms as cyber and AI-related confrontations? Thank you.
Which kind of conflict to dominate? That's the first one, and then yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk, Professor. My name is Zoe Edwards, and I'm a second year here at the Diplomatic Academy. So in your 2010 book and also in your talk here, you cite falling birth rates as one of the reasons for the decline of war and the decline in popularity of war.
Well, falling birth rates within a setting of rising wealth.
Yes,
and
and the affiliate.
Expecting and hoping more for your children.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
And as a father of 3 and a grandfather, I know this feeling well.
But in my perception, this is a pattern that we have observed in the United States, and yet in your data sets, at least the one you used in your 2010 book, the United States initiated 4 out of the 5 wars that it participated in. So how do you reconcile this trend with the pattern in the United States of continuing to have war be quite popular, strong support for the military, and continued initiation of armed conflict?
Yep.
Thank you. I'm gonna keep
track, because if you ask 5 people, I may not have everything in mind.
Thank you also from my side. My name is Alma Neubau, and I'm a second-year student here at the Diplomatic Academy as well. I have more of an empirical question. So you said earlier that your dataset includes wars and interventions since 1945, but much of today's coercive attacks or behaviors operate in gray zones. So you could say like disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, and so on and so forth.
Hybrid warfare.
Hybrid warfare, exactly.
Okay.
So did you conceptualize these in your framework as well? And if yes, to what extent? And maybe also more broadly, can your irrationalist theory extend to nonviolent yet confrontational struggles as well? Thank you.
Good question.
Thank you.
And thank you again. My name is Eva, and I'm a second-year MI student as well. And in 2002, you wrote a paper on ethics and interests.
My past is going to come back to haunt me here.
And so in there, you pose a question whether any action is defensible if it's phrased as a defense of national security. Okay. I wonder whether this still holds true, as you posed that fear is usually the driving force. Do you think, in this case, fear overrides ethics, and do war ethics even exist? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. And then to Ralph, yeah.
I'm a big fan of your work. My name is Ralph Janik. I'm assistant professor in international law at Sigmund Freud Private University. My question does not concern international law, but psychology. When is the moment in time? And I had this was the one thing I didn't learn about during reading your first book, which I'm a big fan of, as I said. When is the moment in time when a private individual becomes this embodiment of the state? So when does Trump no longer think he wants to make himself richer, but he personifies the US as a person in international law? Or from Putin, we have these statements where he said he's looking forward from the early times of his presidency to being a private citizen again. When is that moment when you no longer act on your own behalf? Because Trump now seems stuck in he's still a private individual who wants to become rich, but when is the moment when you become the representative, the official, the president, properly speaking? Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I answer?
Let's do one more question. That's the last one, and then I'm gonna knit, and I've written down all the questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really tremendously interesting.
Thank you.
What I'm interested in is playing around with this idea of thumos and how it interacts with some core assumptions of international relations. How it interacts with some key assumptions of international relations. As a first step, perhaps with both the anarchy assumption and that we sort of have this Hobbesian model of a war of all against all, could perhaps this competition for standing be an alternative for war, and could we construct like alternative arenas that states could compete in? Or could this even be a way to make Wendt's theory of anarchy, is what states make of it, and we don't need this Hobbesian thinking come true, as you maybe hinted at? Or would it be sort of a natural fallback if these artificial arenas fail, that states will resort to violence in any case?
Thank you. This is it now in terms of the questions.
All very good questions.
And so the first
you're
one
going to refresh my mind. What's the first question?
The first one was types of conflict. What types of conflict dominate?
What types of conflict dominate? So I've argued that the dominant form of conflict with these 26 cases, colonialist and post-colonialist war, is history. The kinds of wars I think are most likely in the future are proxy wars, wars of revenge. And wars of revenge, I had 16 cases and I had 18 for proxy war. Proxy war is a conflict in which, rather than intervening directly, a state has somebody else do its dirty work. So consider Iran using militias against Israel. I mean, both Hamas, especially Hamas, can be considered an Iranian proxy, as can the Houthi rebels, although, of course, both would deny that they're a proxy, but they're trained and armed and encouraged by Iran. And Iran does this because it has a range of motives for wanting to weaken Israel, but also a strong incentive to avoid a direct war because Israel would attack it quite successfully, one assumes. So proxy wars are high on the list because they generally involve low cost. Even if you lose, you just cut loose of the proxies. Proxy wars are also associated and made possible by the existence of partition countries. It's not a surprise that it occurs in the Middle East, where the underlying, or one of the underlying causes of tension is between Israelis and Palestinians, which has become internationalized in the region. Wars of revenge are wars motivated by anger, by thumos, because getting even is the flip side of gaining status. You've lost it and now you're going to get back. Classic example is the 1979 attack by China on Vietnam, which came in the aftermath of Vietnam sending its army into Cambodia to overturn Pol Pot, who was a Chinese, how shall I put this, not a Chinese puppet, but very much in the Chinese camp and supported by China. Vietnam supplanted China as the dominant power in Cambodia. China chose to punish Vietnam, attacked its northern provinces, and in fact was forced to withdraw by the Vietnamese army. So if you put together partition countries, proxy wars, and wars of revenge, you get a very nasty combination whose effects are synergistic. And if you add to that an aggressive leader who wants to demonstrate his or her authority through the use of force, that becomes a very likely recipe for a war. And it's these kinds of conflicts I think the international community should be paying attention to. But again, here we have to ask ourselves, do we want to focus our attention on the most common kinds of wars, or do we want to prevent what could be the most destructive kinds of wars? And I think clearly we need to do both. So we also need to focus on conflicts where there would be the possibility of the use of weapons of mass destruction, given the horrendous consequences of such use.
Next question was about the United States again, its motivations, its interests. So you had the falling birth rates on the one hand, US still going to war on the other. How do we bring it together?
Oh, right, yes, you asked that. I remember that. It was over here. It was you, yeah. You're the guilty party. Yeah. So the US is interesting because you have to see where the US military comes from. 62% of the officer corps and slightly less of the enlisted people are from the South. The South is the last part of America in which an honor culture is alive and well. An atavism, if you like, I used the term earlier, held over from antebellum South, which had very different, more traditional values than the more industrial East and Middle West, where dying for your country is still seen as something very valuable by individuals and their families. So the cost involved is acceptable, whereas in other parts of the country, it's very much less so. It's also true that in democracies, we have good evidence for people who do public opinion studies, that publics don't want to go to war. But presidents and prime ministers, and this is before the internet, right, who control or dramatically influence sources of public opinion, can build up in a period of 6 months to a year majorities in support for what they want to do. So a year before the US went into Iraq, only 30-something% of the public wanted to do it. By the time George Bush invaded Iraq, 62% of the people, which is still pretty low, supported going to war. But that percentage and that level of support dropped precipitously, as it did earlier in Vietnam. So democracies can go to war when presidents mobilize opinion, but they have to win and be out very quickly. So it can be done, but under these very limited conditions.
Next question was about hybrid war.
Oh, yeah. So hybrid war. So we're now distinguishing. Oh, and I'll leave me 1 minute at the end because I want to introduce ethical traps, which I should have earlier. Hybrid warfare is a way of waging war as opposed to a cause of war. And what I'm looking at in this book are the causes of war. But you could say that if you can wage war with low cost to yourself, then war becomes a more attractive action. And if you can make fuzzy the distinctions between peace and war, that too has important implications for whether war should be fought. So here's Putin, in his own way, already waging war against Western Europe through hybrid warfare of all kinds. And Europe, until recently, has been pretending that this hasn't happened. It's no longer doing this, but it remains to be seen how effectively it responds, which of course requires a consensus. So yes, you could take it another step, that with the ability to damage or destroy infrastructure through information warfare, it's conceivable that one could come to a point where you could bend or break the will of an adversary without necessarily killing anybody, or at least directly. I mean, if you damage infrastructure, people die as a result of the collateral of the damages. But that too would blur the distinctions between war and peace, and would cause me to write another book.
which may happen, right? The next question was about the justification of war, defending the nation. Does that still work as a justification?
Yeah, so everybody who goes to war offers the justification that we're defending the nation. Whether it's Putin, you name it, there's no leader that publicly says we're going to war to make conquests and to enrich ourselves at the expense of our neighbors. I'm waiting to hear somebody say that. It hasn't. Whether publics believe it is, of course, context dependent. And you go a step further, leaders never say we're going to war to increase our standing or to defend our honor. War is always justified on the grounds of fear of loss from an enemy, both physical and economic. And that's the dialogue. And you'd like to think that people would see through that. And ultimately, and I should have mentioned this, putting an end to war requires serious, educated publics. And publics who are able to see through propaganda, which of course is becoming more difficult now with AI and the internet. So there's kind of been one step forward and two backwards, which is not encouraging.
And next question was Ralph's. Ralph is an excellent international lawyer. I have to introduce you a little bit, and doesn't only do really great scholarly work, but he's also in the media quite a bit. So with very good analysis, so talking to the public. But his question was not about international law. His question was more about political psychology. So about the private person moving into office.
Yeah, I remember. I
I
have it now. So, yes, my great role model here is Cincinnatus. And some of you may know that Cincinnatus was, I think, the first Roman elected or chosen to be dictator. And he was given absolute power for a limited period of time to deal with a serious emergency threat to Rome. He coped very well with it, so well that they asked him to continue in office. He said no. He said, I was basically hired to do this. I'm going back to my farm. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to happen often. Alas, power goes to the heads of people, and they don't step down, and sometimes with tragic consequences. Consider the counterfactual, and as Marcus knows, I love counterfactuals. That Joe Biden had said 2 years into his term in office, I am a one-term president. I came in to do this job. I've done it. I'm stepping down. I'm retiring at the end of my term. That would have given the Democrats 2 years to field candidates, to have them tested through primaries to see their relative support by the public. We would not have ended up with a candidate who was seen as an inside job and who did not do well against Donald Trump. I seriously believe that if Biden had stepped down and let politics run his course, Trump would not have had a second term, and the world would be a different place. It's very hard to give up power of all kinds, not only political office. It changes how people think about themselves. There are, however, healthy people that when they leave office continue to have productive lives. Case in point is Barack Obama or Jimmy Carter, if we stay with American examples. And your question also, though, asked the extent to which people see themselves as representatives of the state or as beneficiaries of the state because they hold office. It seems very clear to everybody that Trump has outrageously and illegally used his office to further enrich himself. And that he claims to be president for everyone, but he's treating the country as a real estate holding, which is the only thing he knows how to do, and of course he doesn't do that well, either in real estate or in politics. For leaders to see themselves in this positive way that you would like, I think it takes two things. It takes personality of a leader, but it also takes a political system in which leaders are only, let me just fix this, it's coming off.
Or you use it as a microphone. I sometimes do that too when it's...
Help me here.
When it gets on my nerves, I sometimes use it just as a microphone. But it should be okay.
Thank you.
Again. Yeah.
You also need a political system where the leader is only primus inter pares and not so much above everybody else. And of course, in America, with the presidential system, that's not helpful in that regard. I hope that answers your question.
And the last question we had was again about the thumos. So relationship of that concept with key assumptions or key concepts in international relations, such as anarchy and standing.
All right. So anarchy, I argue, is a fiction. And let's start with Hobbes. Hobbes did not intend anarchy as a real description of the world. For Hobbes, anarchy was a thought experiment. What would the world be like if we didn't have states and authorities? And he answers there would be no constraints on the appetites and passions, so it would become a war of all against all. Because not only would there be no constraints, but people only gain other motives when they become members of society. They become civilized. And this is an important role of the state, to sustain the kind of order that allows human societies to function. So he used it not as a description in any way of the real world. Anarchy, as a description of the world, was an invention of the Germans in the 19th century. And it was invented as was the legal concept that international law didn't apply to states' use of force because states had a right to do whatever was in their interest. These were all a kind of a German intellectual conspiracy to justify the use of power by a German state, both to unify and then to become more powerful. We should not accept this kind of shoddy intellectual maneuver as any description of reality. Unfortunately, international relations is rooted in German intellectual tradition. I mean, Max Weber, Hans Morgenthau come out of this. But even Morgenthau was very clear that anarchy is not an appropriate description of what he called international society. I mean, this pernicious word, international system, allows us to talk about anarchy. For Morgenthau, the balance of power only worked in Europe because it was a tightly bound society with rules and orders in which all the major powers saw the benefit of preserving the rules of the system and the existence of one another. And that's not anarchy, that's a society. What we have in today's world are regional societies that go from being very thick, as they are in North America, pre-Trump, and Europe, and very weak to non-existent let's say, in the Middle East, which would be the most furthest from the European system. And we have to be very clear in treating anarchy as an extreme case and all the world as having degrees of society from thin to thick. And as I noted in the lecture, and I'm going to write an article to elaborate this further, that anarchy not only is a propaganda tool, but to the extent that society breaks down, it's a function of wars. It's not the principal cause of them. So Alexander Wendt is right in the sense that we can make of society what we want, but he's wrong in framing the issue that there is such a thing as anarchy that we have to escape from. It's Waltz who also fosters this view. Waltz he invents it for reasons of his own, having theoretical.
Ned, thank you so much. It was a great talk. Thanks a lot for answering all these questions.
My pleasure. They were such good questions. Thank you all for asking
good questions as well. So it was really fun. So thanks a lot, Ned, to you, and thanks a lot to you as an audience.
Thank you.
Good. Now you deserve your dinner.